Hello and welcome to part 3 of this opening beginners tutorial series here on Table Flip Games. I'm Tommy, and in this video I'm going to get us up and running in the Visual Studio editor and writing our own code within the developer environment. As mentioned back in the introductory video, Visual Studio is an IDE, or Integrated Development Environment, where it has all the tools and toys we need in order to actually get working. Now, if you recall our last video on the Hello World program, we wrote a simple executable that prints the phrase Hello World to the screen. We wrote our Hello World program through use of Notepad++, and then compiled and executed it using the Visual Studio developer command prompt. Now, this was important, as it reinforced the points made in the first video of this series that we need to compile a piece of code in order for it to be turned into an executable that we then later run. The thing is, this is quite a time-consuming and awkward process when I have to save the file in Notepad++, then go into the developer command prompt, run the compiler, check the output, then run it again. Naturally, there are ways to speed this up, and developers such as myself haven't written code like this on a day-to-day basis in a very long time. As such, let's find a way to speed this up, and from this point onwards continue to use Visual Studio, the actual developer environment, to write our C# code. This is more in line with how we typically write code, where we use a developer environment in order to write, compile, and run our code all within the same ecosystem. Now, you might be wondering, why the hell did I make you go through all of that in the last video then, if we're going to get into Visual Studio next? Well, the point of that was that you need to understand what's happening in the compilation process, followed by how an executable is both built and then ran. Many people starting out in C# programming, as well as other languages such as C and C++, do so by beginning their journey in Visual Studio. The problem is that you often fail to recognise that compiling and executing the code are then separate and distinct forms. To the point, I've had people in job interviews tell me before that they write Visual Studio. Not in Visual Studio, or one of the many programming languages you can write in Visual Studio. They just write Visual Studio. That's a huge red flag for me, and is indicative that the person in question doesn't understand what they're doing. So, sorry for dragging you through what might have been a painful experience, but it will be useful in the long run. So I'm going to start by launching my installed version of Visual Studio, which back in part 1 I recommended that you go and download one of the more recent community editions. Myself, I'm actually running on Visual Studio 2017 Pro Edition. But by and large, everything we're going to cover in this series is going to be identical, so my using a different version of the engine isn't really going to influence things. Everything will be fine. If you don't have this installed already, go back to the part 1 video where I'll walk you through what you need and how to find it. So here it is here, and next I'm going to go and start creating a new project. So what we'll do is we'll go up to File, and then New, and New Project. Now, this can all get a little bit confusing, but I want to focus on Visual C#, and you can see here that there's a lot of different variations. Now, depending on your installation and what version of the .NET micro framework you've selected, you've got a lot of options, but notably, you get an option for a console app using .NET Core, and then another one that's using .NET Framework. .NET Core is actually something of a revamped version of .NET Framework that's designed to be cross-platform, such that you can deploy your final code on Windows, Linux and Mac OS, and is useful for cloud and mobile development. Now, there is some shared code across both of these, but they're individual distinct things. However, for ease of development for everyone and for what we're going to cover in this series, .NET Core will work fine. So I'm going to select that. And then next up, I'm going to give it a name. So I'm going to call this C# tutorials, and then I'm going to go and browse and I'm going to find the folder that I want to store it in. I'm going to store it in my tutorial folder, code folder here, code folder, that was it, try and remember what folder you were going to put it in. And I've also ticked down here create directory for solution, which means that inside code it's going to create a separate folder for C# tutorials. And let's click OK and let it start building. This is going to take a little minute, it'll take a few seconds. It's highly variable depending on your machine, it might go a lot faster than mine, but there we go. Great. So with the project opened up, it already actually has a C# class written for me. In fact, it's already written the code that I needed in order to do what I showed you in the first video. But it's good for us to do this ourselves. Now there's a couple of quick things I need to cover first before we go any further. There's a whole bunch of menus up here, which might get a little bit confusing, and we've also got all these new panes over on the side. And there's also new stuff in the code, stuff that we haven't seen before either. So we're going to take a moment to walk through all of this, then finish off that program as before, and actually we can compile and run this and we'll see that this works just fine. But I want to actually reproduce it all by hand and show you how we can just write the exact same bit of code that we did before. So let's walk through some notable changes between this and the Notepad++ setup. First up, you'll notice that there are a bunch of extra windows and panes, and I'm just going to drag some of this around here for you to see. The most notable of this in my screen is the Solution Explorer up here in the top right, which shows all the files that comprise the project. We're not really using this yet, but this is where we're going to find and add new C# files and be able to refer to them. And we can see that it's already created one file, program.cs. In the bottom, you also have the Properties tab, and this is telling us information about that particular file, the name of it, what kind of build actions we do on it, and also the full path of that file and where it sits on my hard disk. But those aren't really issues that we have to worry about here. There's also extra windows that haven't propped up yet. They'll usually occur when we try and build the code, when we try to run it. But other views and perspectives that we use for like debugging, we're going to come back to that and I'll show you how to do that in a later video. Now what I want to do is I want to actually rewrite Hello World again. Now the thing is, it's already kind of done it for me, which was really nice, but I want to just build my own file, show you how to do that yourself, and then actually reproduce the code. So sorry program.cs, I know you were great in writing everything for me, but I'm just going to delete that. And I could just done that by pressing delete on the keyboard as well. So I'm going to start by right-clicking on this C# tutorials up here, go to add and then class, because that's actually the project file. So I want to add a new C# class. And you can see here, it's already up the top. There's a lot of other things here. Some of this is actually related to the C# language. We'll maybe come back to them in later videos. But then also you even have like C# mono behavior, which is something you would use if you're writing in the Unity engine. But we want C# class at the top. And I'm just going to call it Hello World, like I did the last time. Click add, and it's added into the project. Good stuff. Now you might be inclined to simply copy and paste from an existing file you already have, but I don't want to do that. Instead, I'm going to write the line of code myself, and I encourage you to follow along because you'll actually notice something interesting happening as a result. See, Visual Studio, like many IDEs, has an autocomplete function, meaning that it actually tries to predict the code I'm trying to write and offers to help me finish it. It also helps act as a reminder to you on how to do specific things if you're not entirely sure what line of code you are trying to write. Not entirely useful just yet, but it will be in the future. So I'm going to start by writing out the main method again. And as I do this, you'll actually see it try to autocomplete this for me. And I'm just going to write it myself, but then on the next line of code, I'm going to actually try and use the autocomplete to make my life easier. So public, here we go. You can see it's actually appearing. Static void main. Go. Also, you'll note up here that there's actually these individual reference messages that are brought up. This is actually something that is really useful when you're writing much more complicated bits of code. And we'll come back to this much later on in my C# videos, where if you have a class that's being used in another file or a method that's being called somewhere else, it will actually tell you how many occurrences both the class and the method have. It's a really, really useful feature once you know how to move around the space, but don't worry about it just now. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use the autocomplete this time to do the console write line. So I'm going to type con to get to, and you can see here that it's actually now presenting console, and it even tells me what it is. It's the class system.console. It represents the standard input, output, and error streams for console applications, and we're going to use it. Now, I'm actually going to show you how to do console input in another couple of videos from now. Right now, we're just doing output. So I can actually just autocomplete by hitting tab, and then full stop. Now, what's interesting is that when I do this, it's now providing me with all the particular methods that I can call on console, which isn't actually something that you would have maybe realized going into this, what was actually happening. We're actually calling the method WriteLine on the class console. That's how that line of code works. So when I actually go in, I can probably scroll all the way down and find WriteLine at the bottom. Or the alternative is I actually could have just started typing it and it would have like narrowed down the list of options based on what I've already typed in. So right line, I'm just going to hit tab again, and this time I'm going to open the brackets. And this is something that I'll come back to later, but it's actually showing me the different method signatures and the different things I can do with that method. Right now, we don't need to worry about that. What we're going to do is just put in a string like we did before. So, hello world, exclamation mark for effect, of course. And actually, before I put the semicolon in, if you notice here, you'll actually see there's a red squiggle. This means it's actually finding a compiler error in my code. But we haven't got to the point of compiling it. It's actually giving me a warning already and going, mate, this code is actually kind of broken. You need to fix something here. So if I just hit the semicolon, that'll fix it. All right. I've done that, so let's build it. Now there's two ways I could try and build it. I can head up to the build menu and I can click on build solution, or I can hit Control Shift and B. For this one, I'm going to actually use the menu option, but in future you'll just see me hit Control Shift B a lot more often. So I'm going to build it. And I think it went just fine. Smashing. Next up, I want to actually run it. So to do that, I'm going to go to debug, and I'm going to use this option here, start without debugging. Now, start debugging and start without debugging are almost identical, except when you're debugging, it's actually going to run the proper debugger and then actually stop the code where necessary. I'll show you how to do that in a later video. Also, once the debugging is finished, it actually doesn't keep the window open to let us see what happened. So we really want to use start without debugging for now, which is also Control F5. And it's opened up a window on my other screen. Let me drag it over. Hello world. Excellent. Press any key to continue, because that's telling us, okay, this program's actually finished. If you just press whatever key on the keyboard you want, it's going to close the window. All right, great. That did it for me. Now, let's actually try and break this for a minute. I just want to see what happens in the event that it didn't work. So if I actually hit the backspace, and then I'm going to hit Control Shift and B this time. Oh, we have a new window. This is the error list window. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click this here just to make sure. So this is actually going to stay with me, but it's popped up down there. Yeah, I can just click that, auto hide it, necessary, or tab it in. So there we go, hidden, brought it back up, and then I'm going to tab it into the project. So now it's going to stay there for me, which is great. And it's a really simple error, CS1002, and you can also Bing it if you want. But what it's telling me is a semicolon was expected at the end of the line. So if I go in, hit that, notice how it's actually gone away, but I haven't actually saved the file yet and then rebuilt it. So I'm going to hit Control Shift B, which automatically saved the file and compiled it for me, and everything's great. The error list is now empty. I can then run the code again, and again, like I say, either go up to debug, start without debugging, or hit Control F5 here. Keeps opening up that other window over there. I'm going to have to fix that for the next video. I'll figure it out, don't you worry. But excellent, we're now back where we were at the end of the last video, only this time we can now move forward with writing more C# code in Visual Studio. Fantastic! So that's it, we're now using Visual Studio as part of our code writing process, which is great. Next we can actually get into the nitty-gritty and get back to writing some variables and expressions, which are the next things I really want to show you how to do to actually be able to store information in a program and then manipulate it in interesting ways. I'm Tommy, this has been part 3 of the C# beginners tutorials here on Table Flip Games. This tutorial, alongside all of our other game development videos, is supported via our Patreon. To get access to all our tutorial materials and other content, head on over to patreon.com/tableflipgames. Thanks for watching.